Today is Wednesday, 6th November, the day when we have had the result of the US presidential election, and I'm making what will be for me an unusual video, and I suspect an unusually short video. Partly, it must be said, because I was up all night long, as many of us were, watching as the results came in, and the result is that my energy levels today are perhaps less than they usually are. But anyway, I think also when one piece of news has dominated the media space to the extent that an American election, and this particular American election especially, has done, well, I think that brevity is probably welcome in response to it. Now, I said that this election has dominated the news space, and I know that there are many people who will push back hard on that. There is a train of thought which says that this election is inconsequential, that whoever is elected in the United States, policy will remain exactly the same, and that things will continue pretty much as they were. And there is a lot of substance to that argument. It's certainly been true of elections past. But I'm not persuaded by it, certainly not in relation to this particular election. I think a number of things need to be said very quickly. First of all, Donald Trump has been re-elected president of the United States. He has been president before, but this is the first time since Grover Cleveland, all the way back in the 1880s, in a political time so different from our own that any comparisons basically don't apply. This is the first time that a president has been re-elected when that president is not the incumbent. As we all know, Joe Biden became president in 2020. Donald Trump lost the presidency in 2020. Actually, Biden became president in 2021, January 2021. But he won the election in 2020. Trump lost. We've had 4 years of Biden, and now Trump is back. And that is already extremely unusual. And it tells us that something about American politics has changed and that things are not as they were. Now, saying that, it's perhaps important at this point not to underestimate the political force which is Donald Trump and the movement he leads. As I said, winning an election in this way, after having lost one previously, is, well, in modern American political terms, unprecedented. And it does tell us a certain amount about the personality of the man who's done this. Now, there are lots of things that can be said about Donald Trump, lots of flaws or apparent flaws of his personality, lots of criticisms that can be made. Every day, if you go to the newspapers, you will find deluges, vast reams of words setting out in fantastic detail all about Trump's foibles, his weaknesses, his eccentricities, bad aspects or alleged bad aspects of his personality. But suffice to say that someone who is able to come back and win the presidency in the way that he has done is a most unusual man. Somebody who's able to keep going in the face of a deluge of court cases and prosecutions. Somebody who's able to brush off extraordinary levels of criticism. Somebody who is able to rise above assassination attempts. Well, that individual is extremely unusual, and in terms of modern American politics, frankly unique. There's an awful lot being written today about the many mistakes that the Democrats have made, Kamala Harris's errors, the Democrats' errors, but one should not overlook the fact that Donald Trump is, by American standards, by world standards, by any standards, a most extraordinary individual and political phenomenon. And one should not overlook also the scale of his electoral and political achievement. I'm going to say this. I think that no other individual in American politics has achieved a level of connection with his supporters and, as a result, a level of electoral success similar to that of Donald Trump since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 1940s. And just to say this again, just as Trump today, Roosevelt had a unique sequence of electoral successes. He's the only individual to have won 4 presidential elections in a row. Right like Trump, Roosevelt fundamentally shifted the entire direction of political debate in the United States. And incidentally, and for the record, rather like Donald Trump, Roosevelt was also deeply disliked by the most or a large part of the US political class, who ran relentless media campaigns against him and often made comments about him and said things about him which are almost as abusive, in fact sometimes every bit as abusive as the kind of things that have been said about Donald Trump today. Now, saying that, I don't want to imply that Roosevelt and Trump are similar or same personalities, or even that Trump is going to be as consequential as Roosevelt was. I'm simply drawing parallels and drawing attention to the fact that we have never seen a political phenomenon in the United States comparable to Trump's since Roosevelt's day. That's what I am saying. And as I said, that is not to be underestimated. Having said that, it is also true that his political opponents have completely misjudged him and his movement and have made a series of extraordinary mistakes, which they seem even this morning to be oblivious to. When he won the presidency in 2016, they told themselves and the world that he didn't win the election honestly, that he won the election because of the covert support given to him by another power, by Russia. And they spent years of investigations trying to prove that fact, except, of course, that they were unable to do it. And then, once it became clear that they would not be able to prove that really extraordinary allegation, they never admitted their mistake, something which many people in the United States, I am sure, will have noticed and which will have damaged significantly their credibility. And then, of course, we've had all the abuse, all the claims, the use of the F word and all of that, which disregards, of course, the fact that Trump has been president already, and all of these terrible things that were expected of him and are expected of him, well, at that time, they didn't happen. And again, I think that has damaged credibility further still. Indeed, if we go back and look at what has happened, it's really remarkable how little is actually said or has been said by the Democrats and the media which supports them about what actually happened during Trump's period as president, because it seems to be so discordant, so contradictory to the narrative that they have created recently. And then, of course, there was the realities, the constant attempts to destroy Trump politically and to come after him personally. 2 impeachments, an unending series of court cases, all kinds of claims and allegations, things which have strained the concept of due process up to and beyond breaking point. If you want to see discussions of all of these issues, then I would suggest that you go to the various live streams that we have done on the Duran with Robert Barnes, in which we have discussed these court cases in detail and have discussed also the fundamental and obvious flaws that anybody with any experience of legal process would see, and which, by the way, has been spoken about not just by us, but even by other lawyers, prominent lawyers, like, for example, Professor Jonathan Turley, who has been politically a Democrat. And not just Jonathan Turley, but others, eminent lawyers as well. So, again, that won't have won over much support to Donald Trump's opponents. It would have meant that they would have looked as people who spoke about defending democracy, even whilst they were acting in a way that was incompatible in many respects with that specific claim. And then, of course, we've had the record of the last 4 years. I discussed in my program yesterday how in the 4 years since Donald Trump was president, the international situation has critically deteriorated. Now, that level of deterioration ought, in my opinion, to answer the common claim which is made that the person in the White House, the person who occupies the White House, the nature of that person doesn't matter. Clearly it does matter, because we have moved within 4 years from a situation of fragile, precarious, and deeply unsatisfactory stability to a situation where we have war, ongoing war, in many, many places. A massive war in Europe, in Ukraine, which the United States has been involved in. Some would say it is engaging in it, using it as a proxy war against Russia, and is losing. Wars in the Middle East, in which Iran and Israel are now launching missiles at each other, where the already terrible conditions in the Palestinian territories have now escalated into all-out fighting and war, in which thousands of people have died, and where we have a humanitarian catastrophe as well, where there is talk, as I've discussed in recent programs, of Iran moving forward with a nuclear weapon program. It's been said by many people outside Iran, many commentators are claiming that the Iranians might be pushed in that direction. And as I've discussed in recent programs, certain comments made in the last week by Iranian officials themselves might hint that that might indeed be the case. So a terrible situation in the Middle East before Biden became president, converted into a catastrophic situation in the Middle East now. And then a massive deterioration of the situation in the Far East and the Asia-Pacific region, a situation where a difficult relationship with China, which was slowly deteriorating from the time of Barack Obama and continued to deteriorate, it must be said, under Donald Trump, but deteriorating slowly, where in 4 years that slowly deteriorating relationship has now become completely venomous, with the United States supplying weapons to Taiwan, the United States constantly hinting that it would not be so sorry if Taiwan were to announce some sort of secession from China, where the President of the United States has repeatedly spoken of Taiwan as an ally and of the United States having some kind of obligation to defend Taiwan, even though there is no public treaty or security agreement that says as much, and where the Chinese government has responded to what they see as the most single important red line in the relationship between themselves and the United States, by pushing forward with all sorts of preparations, military preparations and geopolitical preparations, and where the Chinese president and the Chinese foreign minister are openly accusing the United States in personal conversations with top US officials, including the President and the Secretary of State, of falsity and duplicity. And of course, that doesn't even bring into account the situation, the impossibly difficult situation with North Korea, which has now come in from the cold. It's forging an alliance with Russia. It's having, in effect, the economic embargo, a blockade imposed upon itself, lifted. It's working with the Russians on security issues. I'm not going to discuss the rumours. I suspect, in fact, I'm convinced, fundamentally false story about the North Korean troops in Russia in this programme. But the fact that there is a burgeoning relationship between Russia and North Korea, and that the relationship between China and North Korea has also been largely repaired as well, that is incontestable. And of course, we see growing tensions in the Korean Peninsula. And we've also seen a major collapse in American standing. Just yesterday, before the results began to trickle in, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, important Southeast Asian country, was talking about how he'd come under pressure from the United States to end his friendship with Russia, and how he has refused to do so. We've had the President of Indonesia and the newly elected President of Indonesia, both maintaining strong contacts with Russia. We've had Russian warships visiting Indonesia on friendship missions, making again public Indonesia's refusal to be swayed by the United States into hostility towards Russia. We've seen right across the Middle East how Russian influence, and Chinese influence, by the way, has grown, how Saudi Arabia has mended its fences with Iran, accepted Chinese mediation, welcomed President Putin to Saudi Arabia, and indicated that it may, or perhaps may not be, a member of the BRICS states. We've seen how the global South countries have basically sided with Russia and are doing so increasingly openly over the issue of the Ukrainian conflict. We have seen also how many global South countries and the core Eurasian states, China, Russia, India, and now joined by countries like Brazil, South Africa and others, are moving forward to set up a new global trade and financial architecture. In other words, a massive state of crisis in international relations, and a crisis which is working against the United States in every place. The BRICS countries, including Russia, are going out of their way to make clear, again and again, that they are not acting in a way that is hostile to the United States, that they have been pushed to take these decisions, basically for their own protection, because of the pressure that the United States is exerting against them. But even if we take that seriously, which by the way I do, it nonetheless remains the case that the current administration's policy of dividing the world into a league of democracies and an axis of autocracies, something that they spoke about within months of them taking office in the spring of 2021, has divided the world in a way that has ended up weakening the global position of the United States, isolating it even, instead of enhancing that position. Now, it is often said, it is widely said, that foreign policy has no effect on American elections, that American voters ignore foreign policy when they think about how they're going to vote. Well, that may be true in most situations, in normal situations, but the situation in the world today is not normal. Every day, Americans read in their newspapers, listen on their television and radio and talk shows and social media, or they listen to all sorts of people, all of them aligned with the administration, who feed a constant sense of crisis in international relations, talk about the need to go on escalating, to go on seeking confrontation, to intensify war preparations in the United States, to support Ukraine up to and beyond the point of extreme danger and recklessness. And to say it straightforwardly, I don't believe that this has been without effect. I don't think most Americans want their country to be drawn into more foreign adventures and more wars. I think many people underestimate the education many Americans have received as a result of the disastrous forever wars that have been waged by the neocons around the world ever since they obtained their lock grip on American foreign policy at the end of the 1990s. And I think that most Americans, or at least many Americans, perhaps even a critical mass of Americans, particularly that large community of Americans who's either served in the military or know they have, or know people who have, or are related to people they have. Anyway, I think collectively, altogether, they see this terrible international situation and they are very unhappy about it. And they don't see the current president and the current administration as helping to sort those problems out. On the contrary, they see it as making the situation worse. And of course, if we're talking about the situation in the Middle East, well, the administration has managed to antagonize every constituency. The Jewish community, the Arab community, every community in the United States has been antagonized as the president and his vice president, who was the candidate, has held to an impossible and, by the way, again, ultimately duplicitous line, pretending that they want to rein Israel in, whilst at the same time, in many cases, either egging it on or actively facilitating whatever it is that the Netanyahu government over the last few weeks, months, year has been doing. So I don't believe that foreign policy is quite as unimportant for for American voters, as people say. I think that, if I may say this, I think that there is a certain tendency on the part of people who should and do know better, actually, to underestimate the level of shrewdness and awareness that one finds amongst many people, including people who are at the lower end of the income scale in the United States and indeed in other places. As somebody who, in various stages of my life, have had to interact very extensively indeed with people of many different income and wealth levels, all I would say is this: I find that many times some of the most insightful, intelligent, well-informed comments I hear from precisely those people who, if I can say it, certain types of literati opinion, elite opinion, tend to treat with what I consider to be a completely uncalled for lack of respect. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. But of course, it's not just foreign policy, it is also economic policy. And here, again, I'm going to push back very strongly against the narrative that has been heavily promoted in the United States over the last 4 years. It does seem that in Donald Trump's first term, there was a genuine rise in real living standards in the United States, at least until the pandemic came. The same cannot be said about the last 4 years. Most Americans, especially those, again, on median and lower incomes, have felt under severe economic pressure. They believe, and they believe rightly, that their living standards are falling. Given that they are by far the biggest among the largest group of Americans, the fact that more Americans than not feel that their living standards have fallen over the last 4 years ought to call into question the entire narrative that the United States economy has been growing rapidly and successfully over the 4 years. It is a very strange economy which is becoming richer, even as the people who live in the United States feel that they are becoming poorer. On the contrary, I would suggest that the fact that over a period of 4 years, Americans feel themselves to be poorer than richer argues against the economy having grown in the way that has been said. Perhaps it has not actually, in real terms, in actual terms of production, output of genuine wealth, or all of those things, perhaps it hasn't really grown at all. Now, I say that because, to repeat a point I made in my program yesterday, a lot of what is called growth in the United States over the last 4 years appears to have been the result of very high spending by the federal government. That has resulted in a rise in the deficits, the budget deficit. That has resulted in increases in public debt, which is going at a rate of $1 trillion apparently every 3 months. And of course, increasing spending will increase the GDP numbers, but might not actually mean that the economy itself, the real economy, the economy of shops and factories and farms and living standards, the economy that most people live inside, has really been growing very much at all. And of course, if the economy is growing in that kind of way, then a lot of this extra growth in terms of spending is probably translating into growth in prices. Now, it is widely acknowledged in the United States that there was a very high inflation in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. I'm going to suggest that either the extent of that inflation is being underestimated, or possibly that inflation is still continuing at perhaps a higher rate than the official figures show. And if that is true, then that would firstly go far to explain why people feel that their living standards are falling rather than rising. But it would also further confirm that the economy is not growing in the way that we're being constantly told it has been. It would mean that a lot of the growth that people have been talking about in the United States is actually inflation, higher prices. It is widely acknowledged, in fact, it is a statistical truism, that if you get the inflation numbers wrong, if you understate actual inflation, then you will set your GDP figures too high because you're counting higher prices as growth. So, this has been a problem in the US economy. It is a problem that many people perceive, and that also is a reason why people are unhappy and why they have voted in the way that they have. And then lastly, and I have to say this, the way in which the Democratic Party has run this election has been, to put it mildly, unusual. They ran the election through the autumn and winter and early spring with a president who was clearly becoming less vigorous and active in his ability to perform his duties. That is no longer controversial anymore. At some point, after a television debate with Donald Trump, when the president's frailties became altogether too obvious, they took the extraordinary step of compelling him to step down, not as president, but as candidate. They left him in the White House, in the Oval Office as president, ignoring the fact that his authority after his own party had essentially dumped him, had collapsed, leaving the United States in effect adrift without a strong executive in overall control to navigate through the many problems that the United States, foreign policy problems, economic problems that exist today. And they parachuted in the vice president as their candidate, despite the fact that she had not been tested in a primary season, as candidates for US elections invariably are. And on the one occasion in 2020, when she did, 2019, 2020, when she did seek to become a candidate, she actually did not do well in the primaries. And then after she was parachuted in and became vice president, became the candidate, there was the problem of whether she was standing as a continuation of the existing administration, which had become increasingly unpopular for the reasons I have said, or whether she was in fact, on the contrary, a candidate for change. And that problem, that issue, that question was never at any point answered. And perhaps for that reason, but perhaps also because the vice president has never really had the opportunity, or perhaps the inclination or the personality to come up with a program, she wasn't able to articulate a convincing reason of why she should be elected. It was always negative, calling Donald Trump all kinds of names, endlessly talking about what a defective and terrible person he was or was supposed to be, but scarcely anything explaining why the Vice President, Kamala Harris, was the right person to be elected, to become president, to sit at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, and to lead the United States through this extremely difficult time. So if you put all of these factors together, if you add them all up, you will see that it's not difficult to understand why the outcome is what it is. I am going to suggest also that once more we are seeing problems with the American polling industry. This is the third time that they have got their polling wrong. It is fairly clear to me that Donald Trump's support has been significantly understated in advance of the election. This is now a structural problem which has led to much misunderstanding of the state of opinion in the United States. And one would like to see it changed, but I don't suppose it will be. Now, what happens from this point onwards, whether Donald Trump as president is going to prove equal to the challenges that he faces, which I've discussed, a disastrous global situation, a very, very difficult economic situation. Whether he will prove equal to it, I don't know. I do think that he does have some formidably intelligent and very capable people in his team this time. J.D. Vance, his vice president, Robert Kennedy Jr., and I believe Tulsi Gabbard is there too. And no doubt there are others whom I don't know. So he has potentially a strong team. And of course, we have seen situations where presidents have come in and have faced an absolutely terrible situation and have been able to turn things round. I spoke about Franklin Roosevelt. Well, this is, of course, now almost a century ago, but he was elected president at a time of what seemed to many people economic catastrophe, with a major crisis starting to develop in Europe. Many, many people doubted that Franklin Roosevelt would be remotely equal to the challenge. He was widely believed. If you go back and look at the history and what people were saying about him in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he was widely seen as a rich man from an aristocratic family in New York, somebody who was surrounded by rich friends, somebody who didn't really understand very well the problems of the country and didn't have much of a grasp of what would needed to be done. And of course, he went ahead and proved one of the most transformative presidents in American history, transforming the situation both in the United States and globally. And I think it's fair to say that most people would agree that by the time he left office, as a result of his death, he had proved equal to every challenge. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is going to be the equal of Franklin Roosevelt, but then you never know. He's only got one term, but he does have a capable vice president and a strong team. Who's to say? Anyway, that is what I wanted to say about the election in the United States. We will be doing a live stream about this, Alex Christoforou and I, on Locals and Rumble later today. We will no doubt be discussing this in much more detail then. There'll be an awful lot to say then. And you can follow us on Locals and Rumble, and you can listen to us as we discuss the events of these last tumultuous hours. Now, I will now briefly say a few things about what is going on elsewhere in the world. The most interesting thing, no doubt, over the next couple of days and hours will be to see how the world responds to the election of Donald Trump. Resident, one of those interesting Ukrainian Telegram channels whose precise background is difficult to understand, but which does seem to be remarkably well informed about certain internal matters. Anyway, they are saying that Zelensky is in a state of deep depression, that the election of Donald Trump and the convincing election of Donald Trump has confirmed his worst fears. And he apparently can now see the writing on the wall, and the letter of congratulation, the message of congratulation that has been sent to Donald Trump from Zelensky was apparently, or supposedly, or at least according to Resident, drafted by other people. Now, it would not surprise me, in fact, I would be surprised actually, if it were otherwise. But let me repeat again, I'm getting this information from Resident. The Russians, by the way, are preserving a careful silence. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has said that the Russians have not yet decided whether or not Putin will in fact try to communicate with Donald Trump and will indeed send him letters of congratulation. For the record, I think he will, and I think he should. So that's the response in Ukraine and Russia up to now. I think the Chinese have lots of issues with Donald Trump from the past, but it's important to remember that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump at a personal level got on quite well. And I think that the Chinese will be very, very relieved indeed to see the back, not just of Biden, but of Tony Blinken, especially, who they have no feelings of respect for as Secretary of State, as they have increasingly made clear. So they will be happy to see the back of this particular administration. In Europe, Hungary, where perhaps, possibly, I might be travelling to in a few weeks' time. I received an invitation to go there. In Hungary, Prime Minister Orban will be delighted at the election of a man he rightly considers a friend. But other European leaders, the Germans, the French, others will look on this with dismay. The two governments that are going to be the most dismayed of all are going to be the German government, which committed itself disastrously to supporting the Biden administration and its policy towards Russia, bringing upon Germany an extraordinary economic crisis, and, by the way, even more so, the British government, which made the absolutely idiotic decision, one which I have already discussed both on this channel and even more so in a dedicated program we did about it on the Duran, made the idiotic decision to send people to the United States to campaign or to help the campaign of Kamala Harris, the opponent of Donald Trump. Anyway, the British will be dismayed by this result. There is profound shock, and it is not, by the way, confined to the Labour Party. Yesterday, William Hague, former leader of the Conservative Party, a British neocon, if I may say so, was writing in the Times, making his strong hostility to Donald Trump clear, And the Conservative Party in Britain, which is jam-packed with neocons, and their various newspaper outlets, which the same with newspaper outlets that support them, of which one could say the same, they will be dismayed by this outcome as well. So, of course, will be the various agencies and departments of the permanent government in Britain, which also has no love for Donald Trump at all, as they made perfectly clear after his previous election victory in 2016. So the British will not be happy, the Germans will not be happy, the European Commission will not be happy. Most of the rest of the world, the Arab states, for example, will be relieved. The Iranians have their issues with Donald Trump, to put it mildly. He pulled out of the JCPOA, for example. But it must be said again that they did find it possible to maintain a kind of dialogue with him. And Iran has found itself in a far more dangerous and difficult position under Donald Trump's successor, Joe Biden, than it did during the time when Trump was president himself. So just saying. So anyway, that is the response of most of the world. Over the next couple of days, couple of weeks, we will see how the pieces fall into place as the world digests the outcome of the election. One thing they will be relieved about, and I mentioned this, we discussed this previously in various programs that we did on the Duran. One of the things that they will feel, most of the world will feel relief about, is that there is now finally a prospect of a strong president, or at least a viable president, functioning again in Washington behind the resolute desk in the White House. This terrible period of uncertainty we have been living through since Biden was forced to give up his run for re-election is now finally drawing to an end. And the one thing world governments detest most of all is the sense that in a powerful country like the United States, there is a vacuum of leadership. And they will be relieved that that vacuum is about to be filled and that they have someone in Washington they can actually talk to and discuss things with, rather than face a situation such as the one we've seen, where the man in the White House has no authority and appears to have no control. So, anyway, that's the global situation. Of course, other things are continuing to happen. And in Israel, we have now a very interesting political crisis play out. Prime Minister Netanyahu has suddenly made the decision to sack his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And the Biden administration is said to be deeply dismayed by this. The successor to Defense Minister Gallant is the former Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, who is believed, as I understand it, is a close political ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu. It has seemed to me for a while that Gallant and Netanyahu did not get on very well with each other, and I suspect that the Netanyahu himself and his officials had probably come to the view that Gallant was a political ally of the Biden administration in Washington and was tilting strongly towards the Americans, towards Biden, towards the Biden team, Sullivan and Blinken and all of those people, rather than being loyal to Netanyahu's government itself. It's been an open secret that some members of the Democratic Party, Senator Schumer, for example, have wanted to see a political change in Israel. They wanted to see Prime Minister Netanyahu removed from the scene. And it could be that as the results began to trickle in, Prime Minister Netanyahu, results from the United States election began to trickle in. Prime Minister Netanyahu finally decided that this was the opportunity to get rid of a defense minister who he saw not just as potentially disloyal to himself, but also as a political threat. So anyway, that has happened. It has provoked protests and anger in Israel. It looks as if there's been a great deal of finger pointing about the leaks of classified information. On the eve of the Israeli strike on Iran, certain classified documents of an Israeli provenance circulated in the media, or rather the social media in the United States. I've discussed them in earlier programs, though I have not read them myself. I assumed that those documents had been leaked by people in the United States, but if you listen to some of the rhetoric and some of the anger and claims and counterclaims that are now circulating in Israel itself, one almost gets the impression that some people in Israel, perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials, believe that some of these leaks, and perhaps the leaks of these particular documents, were the work of Defense Minister, or at least former Defense Minister Gallant. Well, anyway, a political crisis of a sort in Israel, but one which I predict is going to leave Prime Minister Netanyahu in an even stronger position than he has been in up to now. He will now have to face, however, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, of course, a friend of Israel. He has been in the past a friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he has also indicated that he is somebody who does not like or want wars, and his vice president, increasingly influential and powerful Vice President J.D. Vance, Trump's most likely successor, he has made it clear that he does not believe that war between the United States and Iran is in America's interests. So, much to look at there. And in the meantime, the war in Ukraine goes on. One thing I am absolutely clear about, and nobody should have any doubt about this, the Russians may be interested in seeing what Donald Trump comes up with, whether he will follow through on what he has said about Ukraine. And by the way, I personally, contrary to a certain school of thought, think he probably will. I think Donald Trump understands perfectly well that Ukraine is a debacle, and I think he also understands that it is in America's interests and in his own political interests to put as much distance between himself and the emerging debacle in Ukraine as possible. And bear in mind that there are people now close to him, Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, Robert Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, who will be advising him to go the same way. Anyway, putting all that aside, the Russians obviously are not going to wait to see what Donald Trump is going to do. Trump, of course, is not going to be president of the United States before January. So we've got several months to wait before he is even inaugurated. Several weeks when Joe Biden is still the president. So the Russians are not going to slow down or the war or change their tactics or change their strategy in any way. And in fact, over the last couple of hours, the information that I've seen from the battlefronts, yes, I still follow, even on a day like this, over the last night, what is going on the Ukrainian battlefronts, is that Russian acceleration is, if anything, intensifying, that the Russians are not being slowed down by the Rasputitsa, by the mud of the autumn rains. In fact, there was even a report this morning that the Russians are in the process of storming Kurachovo itself, that the Russians are pushing through Kurachovo. There's even claims that they reached the central area of Kurachovo, that Ukrainian defences in Kurachovo are collapsing. And of course, yesterday, as I discussed in my programme, the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army was saying that the defences, Ukrainian defences in the villages southeast of Kurachovo, in Antonovka, Ilinka, Yelizavetivka, all of these places were collapsing as well. Well, that may or may not be true. I'm going to say this straight away. I have not yet really seen enough information coming from Kurachovo for me to say with any confidence exactly what is taking place there. But north of Kurachovo, north of the Kurachovo reservoir, I've been seeing lots of things taking place. Not only are the Russians advancing in these places, not only are they taking places like Novo-Alexandrovka and Novo-Dmitrivka and other places around there, but one thing that I have seen from the pictures, the film, which is now completely different, is that we're starting to see Russian armoured columns moving and attacking Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians do not seem to be doing anything to try to interfere with the work of those armoured columns. Where previously, if one saw Russian armour advance, there would always be a cloud of Ukrainian FPV drones coming down and trying to damage or obstruct the Russian armour. One would see some shelling and mortar fire. Over the last couple of days, in this area of southwestern Donbass, at least for the moment, that has all stopped. And that is really extraordinary. In fact, it's also the case that instead of seeing the Ukrainian forces trying to send reinforcements to particular positions, to hold positions, we see more often than not the Ukrainians retreating, often in a chaotic and disorderly way, from positions that they were supposed to be defending. Now, that of course all begs many questions. Is it the case that we're not seeing this resistance, these FPV drones, because Russian electronic warfare systems are now so effective and so advanced that the Ukrainian drones can't function anymore? Or is it some other reason? Is it that the drone operators in the area have all been tracked down and killed? Or could it be that they've all been reassigned to the north, to the area of Kursk and Sumy region, and that they're trying to hold back the Russians there, and that there are not enough drone operators to work? Or could it be that the sanctions that the Chinese have imposed, restricting the export of their drones, is now having an effect, and that there aren't enough of these Chinese drones available for the Ukrainians to convert into drones of their own, FPV drones of their own? I am not able to answer those questions. All I am saying is that the character of the war in this key area of southwestern Donbass is changing. And though the Russians are able to conduct mobile advances and have been able to conduct mobile advances in southwestern Donbass for several months now, I noticed this starting to happen back in July, August, that the Russians have put static warfare in this part of the battlefronts behind them and are able to advance now rapidly across the fields and to attack Ukrainian defenses from many directions. But it's not just that the Russians are able to move. It is that they're now able to move, in effect, unresisted. Something over the last week, or maybe 2 weeks, has changed. And anyway, we will see what it means, whether this is just a temporary thing, whether the Ukrainians are able to reorganize. But for the moment, at least, the Russians are able to push forward, and they will continue to do so. And yes, there's been a lot of news from places like Kupiansk, and the Russians continue their advances there. There are more reports that the Russians are now very close to capturing the villages of Terny and Yampol on the Zherebets River, and that the fighting in Torske is also reaching its culminating point, and that the Russians will soon be in control of that village too, putting them in effect in complete control of the eastern banks of the Zherebets River. But there are also reports, which I have seen, that the situation in Chasiv Yar for the Ukrainians has taken another disastrous turn, that there have been more Russian advances around Chasiv Yar, that the pincers around Chasiv Yar, the Russian pincers, are now closing fast, and that the indications that we got from the Russian leafleting campaigns telling the Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, that is all crystallizing, and that we could be in the final days of that incredibly protracted battle for that particular town. Obviously, I will be returning tomorrow to a more detailed discussion of what is going on in the war in Ukraine. Suffice to say today that the Russians are not going to slow down. What is more likely to happen is that the Russians, who are now becoming stronger every day, are going to continue to accelerate. And if Zelensky is dismayed and depressed by the outcome of the election in the United States, it's difficult to believe that this dismay and depression will not also have an impact on the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines and on wider Ukrainian society. The president, who has been such a strong supporter of Ukraine, even if his relations with Zelensky himself have been, to put it mildly, uneasy. Anyway, that president, Joe Biden, is now quitting the scene. His successor, Donald Trump, has given every indication that he wants to distance the United States from the war. Perhaps he will, perhaps he won't, but that's what he said. The Ukrainians are not going to regard his election optimistically. On the contrary, they will see the fact that he has been elected as discouraging. They will also be discouraged by the fact that the Republicans seem to have won a convincing majority, perhaps even a lopsided majority in the Senate. And as of the time of making of this video, there is still a toss-up, but it looks as if they're more likely than not going to hold on to the House. So that Trump will have strong support in Congress, and support in Congress for Ukraine has also, or so it seems to me, been gradually eroding as well. So this is discouraging, not just for Zelensky, but for the Ukrainian War Party in Ukraine itself, and of course for political leaders in Europe. The Russians, however, to say it one more time, they're not going to assume anything. They're going to say to themselves that they've got to keep going with the war. And of course, they're right to do so. If, for example, Russian defences last year during Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive towards the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea had crumbled, if the Ukrainians had indeed broken through, if the Ukrainian project that the Biden administration launched and the United States government launched and the Europeans launched had been crowned with great success, then of course it's much less likely that Donald Trump would have been re-elected president of the United States. So the Russians have contributed to these events, as they no doubt know, and they've contributed to these events by the success of their arms. And they're not going to make the mistake of laying their arms down simply because of the outcome of an election in America. So the war in Ukraine will continue, whether Trump is able to end it or will simply walk away, or whether the Ukrainians will reconsider their up to now implacable stance, which essentially rejects all negotiations and what the Europeans to do, that all remains to be seen. But the Russian offensive does appear to have changed character. It is proceeding with a level of power and force which I have never seen up to now over the course of this war. And that in itself is important, and it will continue to change the geopolitical climate as it has been doing for a very long time now. So anyway, on this important day, this is where I finish today's programme. Let me remind you again that Alex Christoforou and I are going to be doing a live stream this evening, 1400 hours, or is it 1500 hours? Anyway, look out for the time, on 1500 hours, on EST, Eastern Standard Time, on Locals and Rumble, 1900 hours London time, just to say, if anybody wants to check. You can hear us and see us then. We will talk about the election and no doubt other things. And of course, in terms of our videos, remember, you can find them all on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X and all of the others. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links beneath this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.